All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice, and sometimes drink beer to handle particular subjects of your choice. Ian writes, is the moon landing a hoax? My exacerbation is a little bit exaggerated. I actually do enjoy this question. I think conspiracy theories are an underrated subject of philosophical exploration and entertainment. And so I will be drinking through this. But nevertheless, it is an excellent subject, and we will move forward. Off the bat, on the surface, we don't know. None of us knows for certain. Have governments performed major hoaxes before? Why, yes, they have. Is it common? No, not really. Or is it? How do we know how common it is? If we step back and away from the question itself for a moment about like how accurate is our understanding of the Apollo 13 or the Apollo program and whatnot, and think about this question as a kind of question. We are looking at conspiracy theories. And so the meta question, the question underneath the question is, how do we evaluate conspiracy theories? And the first question we would have to ask for that is, what is a conspiracy theory? Because not all conspiracy theories are alike, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The short answer, the working definition, I think definitions are generally a little bit overrated, but the concept we're working with here is basically any alternative account of history or the present, any alternative account, any non-mainstream account of an event which centers around a hoax or a cover-up, right? And there's we'll get into this a little bit later, but basically, actually, we'll just get there later. I won't prime us with the psychology of it just yet. And it's important to note that not all conspiracy theories are the same. There's a great danger here of meme thinking. There was a joke going around a few years ago actually, during COVID really. What's the difference between the truth and a conspiracy theory? About 6 months. Yeah, it sounds really funny, but it primes us for confirmation bias. We think about all the things they did with ivermectin, the lab leak hypothesis, all these things like that, and we forget all the unproved, or in some cases disproved one. What happened to QAnon? What happened to the Kraken? And those are just the recent ones. The history and talk about history is the graveyard of forgotten conspiracy theories, right? And this is not just contemporary stuff. It's we in the same way that we don't know we don't know what we've forgotten, because the personality that lends itself to conspiratorial thinking is not unique to the present time either, or at least we have no reason to assume so. So, but let's bring ourselves back to present for the moment. The problem with conspiracies, and what I'm going to call the conspiratorial the conspiracy instinct. It's not a conspiratorial instinct. You're not inclined to conspire, but the conspiracy instinct. The problem with that is that conspiracy theories can themselves be conspiracies. Even if you grant the level of propaganda that is presumed, in some cases justifiably so, in the mainstream accounts of all events. For myself, I presume that all mainstream accounts of all events, all of them, are either are incomplete at the very least. Sometimes maybe outright false. And that's, it doesn't need, we don't need to assume malice. We just don't know everything that went into every event. There is a book recommendation that was made by, one of the classic subjects that gets brought up in this domain is the Holocaust, for example. And there is a book that is recommended by Curtis Yarvin called Human Smoke. I forget the author's name. But the book, I have it on my shelf. I haven't read it yet. But is basically, it's not even an account, really, supposedly. Again, I haven't read it. It's supposedly just a collection of primary source texts, letters, and things from the time. And the picture it portrays of these firsthand events is that no one truly understood what was going on. It wasn't to say none of it was intentional, but it does seem to portray that the final solution was not the first solution. But it also portrays it clearly happening. The German motivation behind it was built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of America and its interests and its what it was likely to do, and everyone was misunderstanding each other, which is more or less how you would expect history to play out. But to come back to, even if you assume not just malice at the highest levels of government and manipulation, but competence, the ability to do that, then their propagandistic and the skills with their psyops extend even to the alternative theories. And I can give a real world example of this. There is a gentleman named Adrian Vermeulen who co-wrote a paper with Cass Sunstein, a famous psyoper of the Obama administration, if I remember correctly. Who they co-wrote a paper about how to deal with conspiracy theories. And their conclusion from their paper was that the best way to deal with conspiracy theorists was to join them, to enter them and subvert them from the inside. Sometime after that publication of that paper, Adrian Vermeulen jumped in front of the Christian nationalist parade and is now a kind of leader of that movement. I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right? Where that brings us back to the epistemology part of it. If you are going to doubt the trustworthiness of official stories and find yourself leaning towards conspiracy theories, well, the problem is that same epistemic distrust must also be applied to the unofficial ones for the same reasons. At the end of the day, we have to evaluate these claims as claims directly. And it's also better mental hygiene to think this way too. There's a couple of Princess Bride references to make here, but a lot of conspiracy thinking, I feel like, can be summarized in the iocane powder battle of wits from the Princess Bride. You wouldn't put it in front of me because you know that man is mortal. You'd want it as far away from yourself as possible, but you would know that I would know this, so you would put it in front of yourself. But you would know that I would know that you would know. And it's just, it doesn't get you anywhere. It's a stupid game of psychological rock, paper, scissors, trying to imagine I was just talking about this in another section where I think it applies, but when you play the "if I were the devil, what would I do to subvert the world" game, as soon as you start thinking of the other person as being aware of yourself, it's just a guessing game of anticipation that gets you nowhere. And you have to just evaluate the claims directly. So, when we are evaluating claims in situations of uncertainty, we can't come to any conclusion with certainty. So we have to rely upon some heuristics. what are some good heuristics for evaluating not just conspiracy theories, but claims generally? The first thing to be aware of, and this is a Scott Adamsism, I've become a big fan, even though I have my criticisms of him. I don't agree with him on everything. I don't agree with the simulation theory, for example, but he's still a great source for exactly this kind of thing. The first heuristic guideline for thinking about these kinds of subjects is beware of the documentary effect. And that's the idea that if you've only seen one side, you don't know anything. Documentaries can persuade people of all kinds of things. And I think I've brought this up in a previous video, but there's one that's been going around. Actually, I haven't seen it, but I keep running into people who have, and that's Europa: The Last Battle. And this is a Holocaust denial documentary. It's apparently very good. It's apparently very well made. But I'll run into people who have watched this, and they'll say things like, that they didn't have enough time. There literally wasn't enough time to gas and then burn all of these bodies in the crematoriums. Literally, they do the math, and like 6 million bodies, and this number of crematoriums and this amount of time, assuming this amount of time for body. And to which I replied, like, where's the mainstream account that claims that even most of the 6 million dead Jews were cremated? None of them say that. They'll talk about the wooden doors, the gassing rooms. They had wooden doors. They weren't even airtight. I have gassed rodents before. I was pest control tech for a couple of years. I have used some pretty nasty substances on rodents and insects, and you don't need airtight spaces to do that. you don't. Where are the it's like superficially, it's a superficially sensible point to the biases of modern assumptions. But when you think about it for more than 5 seconds, there are these massive holes in these things, but those are never addressed in a documentary. A documentary only shows one side of any subject. So the answer to the way to get around the documentary effect and the dangers of the documentary effect, and this goes in both directions, of course, is to listen to debates. Try to find debates. Now, Ian, in asking this question, sent me a link to a debate as well. And it was a debate between Joe Rogan and Matt Walsh. A brief segment of Joe Rogan's interview with Matt Walsh. It was a very good back and forth. Joe Rogan asked some very good questions. Joe Rogan being on the skeptical side of the moon landing, not a denialist, which means he is, I'll say, epistemologically sophisticated in his view. He's saying, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying I have questions. I'm not sure anymore. That is very, very defensible, good ground to be on, saying, I don't know. I will list 2 other debates that I have seen on this subject. There was a very interesting debate between Tim Pool and a bit of a comedian provocateur, Alex Stein, sometime early last year, if I remember correctly. That was very very fun, very amusing. Highly recommend. It's a fun back and forth, as is the Joe Rogan one. And I recommend both of those just for entertainment. They're fun conversations. They are interesting. They ask good questions, and they do make you think, which is one of the values of exploring these conspiracy theories. I'll bring up a third one though, because it's illustrative of another point that we'll get to in a little bit, and that's a debate on the YouTube channel called Modern Day Debate. And Modern Day Debate does a lot of really annoying subjects. There's a lot of flat Earth debate on there, like a lot of it. We'll get to flat Earth in a minute too. I have this mapped out on a bit of a outline because there's so much going on here. But the modern day debate that I saw was a debate between MCToon and Peter Markley against Dr. RV and very, very special Kyle Adams. Many of the comments congratulated Kyle on being the persistent return award winner for possibly dumbest person on the internet. Which is mean, but maybe not unfair. What you get a sense of the arguments that are attractive to the people on these sides of the debate, and not every type of person on each side of the debate is in the same camp. Someone like Joe Rogan, who is a skeptic, is in a very different camp than someone like Kyle Adams, who is quite certain that it could not have happened. So, anyways, the point is that documentary style videos that only present one side of a case and do so at great length are not good for clear thinking and coming to correct conclusions. It's good to watch a documentary, but you should watch alternative accounts as well. You should try to triangulate as best as possible, and debates are really the best way to go. The second valuable heuristic when evaluating conspiracy type arguments, but also arguments in general, is to we've said beware of documentary effect. Also beware of any argument that has the God of the gaps structure. Now, what's the God of the gap structure? I'm drawing this from theology debates, because that's where I spent most of my time in my 20s, in listening to theology debates, because I enjoyed it. Apologetics, really, more than theology. And there was a particular kind of argument that was made against the sort of biological and physics arguments against God. So that you listen to like a Lawrence Krauss or a Richard Dawkins, they make all these scientific arguments about how God is not necessary, God doesn't make sense. And then the Christian apologist would respond with, oh, but you can't explain this. You can't explain how to make a hummingbird. You can't explain abiogenesis. You can't explain how one species can turn into another species. You can explain how species change a little bit over time, but not how they turn into a completely other species that can't interbreed and whatever. You can't explain this. You can't explain that. You can't explain how matter could come from non-matter. You can't explain. And the problem with this structure is that they also don't know. They're appealing to ignorance, essentially. They're saying, I don't know, therefore God. That's a non sequitur. And it also has a very tragic and kind of sad tendency to just be eternally receding backwards. It's like, well, you can't prove how one species turns into another species. Oh, but 10 years went by and now you can show that. Well, you can't show how life began in the first place from non-matter. 10 years go by. Oh, well, okay, so you can show that, but you can't show how how matter began in the first place. Then Lawrence Krauss comes out with his, something from nothing book or whatever. And they just kind of we'll back off from that. But many of these conspiracy theory arguments have this same structure to it. They say, we can't explain X, therefore cover up. Therefore conspiracy. Therefore, we don't know X, therefore I know Y. It never follows. It never follows. And there's a softer version of this, which is an appeal to incredulity, that is just an assertion that X is impossible. A very, very interesting version of this argument, and this is a more sophisticated argument. This is something you should take a little bit more seriously. Is a writer named Vox Day has proposed a numerical argument against evolution. He's claimed that basically the short version of it is basically no matter how rapid evolution happens, there must be an average rate of mutation across time. And the question is, what is that rate? And no matter what number scientists provide as the average rate of mutation, it never seems fast enough. It's never even close to fast enough to explain how life could have evolved from single-celled organisms over, we'll say, 2.5 billion years. It's not even close to enough time. Not to reach the level of complexity we have today. Does that disprove evolution? Kind of looks like it should, right? But it's an appeal to incredulity. I don't see how this could have happened, therefore it's impossible. Logically, it's actually a valid argument. But practically, in reality, how often does that predict the actual outcome? Very, very rarely, because we don't know what we don't know. What usually happens in cases like that is that we discover something 10 years later that says, oh, there was this other factor that we didn't know about. That's like, oh, here, like, this is how we explain. There, maybe you look at, who's the guy with punctuated equilibrium? Gould, right? And the big Gould-Dawkins debate about how evolution happens. Gould's hypothesis of punctuated equilibrium, that evolution doesn't happen in a gradual process, but comes in big spikes, and then things stay the same, and then it spikes again with dramatic amounts of change because you have these intense selective environments that can dramatically change species over, 7 or 8 generations or something. We could have events like that, or possibly even events that dramatically change the rate of mutation. That might be actually logically required for that to work. But again, it's an interesting argument. But you should always look for the God of the gaps structure, these appeals to incredulity, and these deductions that because we don't know something, therefore we know something. That's always very dangerous, and it's epistemologically, and it's always often very common in conspiracy theories. So, finally, when we evaluate these kinds of claims, and this ties in with how we are able to group conspiracy theories together, because often they're on the surface, they feel they should be completely different. They should be completely different in kind. But for some reason, we know what kinds of theories group together that we call conspiracy theories, and this last point is, I think, a big part of why we can do that. And this third point, behind the being aware of the documentary effect and being aware of the God of the gap structure, is who is making the argument. Now, as with the last one a little bit, this is not a logical rule. This is, in fact, in formal logic, a kind of fallacy. This is known as the ad hominem fallacy, going after the person instead of the argument. However, we're not trying to persuade other people necessarily. We're just trying to determine what is likely for ourselves in circumstances of incomplete information. And heuristics are valuable in doing that. And the problem with the ad hominem fallacy for our kind of epistemology is that in certain cases, ad hominem is predictive. There is a certain kind of person who is a kind of reverse indicator. And I believe there's a particular reason why the sort of person that is drawn to conspiracy theories is often a reverse indicator. And I'll just say it right now. It's because the psychology behind a certain kind of conspiracy theories is that they are so jaded and so demoralized to that they, if they become suspicious that if any view becomes too mainstream, it must be false. It must be propaganda. So if their own view from 5 years ago were to become accepted and mainstream, they would reject it. And they're like, oh, I fell for that too. They're like hipsters who their favorite band gets too big and they have to hate on them now. That doesn't mean they're always wrong about everything. To be clear, we can't make that assumption either. But when a particular position on a given issue is universally embraced by a certain kind of person who is who has a psychological motive for moving towards all conspiracy theories, towards all alternative accounts that lean towards cover-ups and hoaxes and propaganda, that's a bad sign for the credibility of that position. And sometimes it's a very subtle distinction. And again, that tendency doesn't mean they're wrong, but it is a negative indicator. And I think the best, if there's one thing I could recommend everyone go see, I'll link it down below. Professor Ryan Reeves, who's a seminary professor at Gordon Conwell University, I think. I did a podcast about Flat Earth last year, and you can go watch that too. But I'll just link to Ryan Reeves' own little documentary, which you should watch in conjunction with the Flat Earth people themselves, because again, we want to avoid the documentary effect as well. You should hear both sides of this. But Ryan Reeves presents the history of the Flat Earth movement, and it goes back to this guy named Samuel Rowbotham, who is a Christian socialist from the 18th, early 19th century, thereabouts. And he basically, the Flat Earth movement grew out of the Christian utopian socialist movement as a kind of an emotional reaction to Newtonianism and to a degree to industrialism. And the when you look at Samuel Rowbotham's life and the reasons he gives and the arguments he gives, he's a very interesting character. To be clear, it's someone you should probably learn more about to understand the psychological type. But when you see the people behind it and the motives that become very clear when you understand that, it becomes very hard to take the position they are advancing itself seriously. Which again, in a philosophy channel, does not mean that you should not entertain it, because it's good intellectual exercise. And they might have some interesting points. They might have some things you hadn't seen before. There was a very interesting flat earth argument made by a guy who set up a camera on a tripod in front of the Great Lakes. And he said it was a very high-powered Canon camera. And he just zoomed in across the lake. And he said, if the earth is curved, I should not be able to see as far as I can see here. I can see, 100 and something miles away. But I should only be able to see, 40 something miles away before the objects on the far side of the shore become hidden below the curvature of the earth. Now, there are some very interesting mathematical reasons why his argument is not quite as compelling as it looks on the surface. But it looks really, really compelling on the surface. And it is good to not just dismiss these people out of hand for your own mental training. And I can't stress that enough. But if you have to make a snap decision, it's always the safe bet to assume that the people with the conspiracy instinct are going to be on the wrong side. So with those heuristics laid out, and I should say, let me go through the list real quick as for while we're talking about conspiracy inclined people. I listed 3 debates earlier that are very worth listening to. That would be Joe Rogan and Matt Walsh, Tim Pool and Alex Stein, and Kyle Adams and Dr. RV with MCToon and Peter Markley. Joe Rogan is not a conspiracy person. He enjoys conspiracy theories. He thinks they're fun. He gets invested in them. But he also calls bullshit very quickly. And he calls bullshit on a lot of conspiracy theories. Even ones he kind of wants to believe. But he's like, nah, that couldn't happen, whatever. Alex Stein is a tricky one because he's a very funny dude. And he's a provocateur. So he will intentionally say things that are a little bit over the top to kind of get people to think and so forth. But he does not strike me as a naturally conspiracy-oriented person. He strikes me as just someone who fell victim to the documentary effect. But if you watch the modern day debate video with Kyle Adams is absolutely a conspiracy-minded person. You can actually see the gears turning, see the way his mind works, and hear it in his voice. And if you learn to recognize that, you'll avoid a lot of obnoxious, time-consuming traps. If you don't have the time to wade through these things. So, with these 3 basic heuristic rules for evaluating conspiracy theories out of hand, and before I go there, it is worth pointing out that many of the conspiracy theories that were proved, for example, in the COVID cases, were advanced and latched onto by very serious people who are not naturally, I'll say, gullible, who are not naturally willfully open to every alternative explanation that revolves around a hoax or a cover-up that comes across their YouTube feed. So with all that laid out, did the moon landing happen? On the argument for is we have pretty good evidence for it. We got video, we've got people who say they went, came back, we got moon rocks and stuff. It looks like we went, it's a part of our history text. It's kind of the default assumption. So that's a good starting evidence. But then we have some arguments against. First of all, we had good reason to fake it. Cui bono? The United States, because we were in the Cold War. We were trying to one-up Russia. We had the motive to fake it. Did we have the means to fake it? Probably. It would have been a lot more technically tricky to do it convincingly than a lot of people imagine, I think. And there's a lot of very tedious back and forth. It was like, oh, is this guy moving right? Look at the rock dust. The gravity isn't simulated right, and whatever. Evaluating very, very technical analysis of the video that came back. It's, I don't find that part very interesting. Could it have been faked? Potentially. It would have been very tricky, but could have been done. So we had reason to fake it. 2, a lot of things look fishy. Same idea. This is one of the things that Joe Rogan brings up a little bit. It's like there are some things that look faked. Was it faked by slight modification to make it more appealing to the public? Like if you put a filter on a photo that you put up on Instagram, is that faked? Well, like kind of, but not really. It is still a real photo, but like it's been modified. But an AI, fake photo detector will pick that up as modified or whatever. So, but there's a lot of fishy things going around. There's a lot of fishy stuff. We've lost original documents. So there's a lot of strange things going on there. And 3, it was technologically very difficult. And this is like the core Joe Rogan argument. The core Joe Rogan argument is, how do we get past this radiation belt? Set aside the rockets, set aside the spacesuits, set aside the design of the craft and the design of the lander and the relaunch and the return, which is like half the challenging part. Like, it's insanely technologically difficult to get people into space at all, then to get them to land on the moon, to walk around on the moon, collect stuff, come back. One of the hardest things humans have ever done in history. Is it even possible? Insanely difficult. We have counters to some of these arguments. As far as we had good reason to fake it, well, the evidence that we went there looks stronger than the reason to fake it. Like, we had good reason to fake it, but it's not like the success of the Cold War hinged on that. The Russians could have beat us to the moon and we still could have won the Cold War. It was a fun gold star to have, but the geopolitical success of these superpowers did not hinge on the Apollo program. It was just a fun side quest that was a little bit of a morale boost, maybe. The reason to fake it was not that strong, and it was pretty strong, but it wasn't that strong, And the evidence that we have that we went is a lot stronger, And the second counter argument on the 4 side, what about a lot of things looked fishy? Well, a lot of things look fishy in any big complex event. In any big complex event, there's going to be things that the lay people won't understand or be able to explain. And how things normally go often defies how we would, as a lay person, expect that they would go. So, of course, there's going to be things that look fishy, but oftentimes, if you do a little bit of investigation, things that look fishy to us actually are exactly the way it should go by the physics. And in fact, when things are a little too perfect, too on the nose, as Scott Adams says, oftentimes that's more of a sign that something is fake or not quite believable than if there's some odd things. So some things that we have a hard time explaining is totally non-unique, totally normal. Which leaves one unaddressed argument against, which is that it was technologically very difficult. Very difficult to do. So, conclusion. The best argument for the fact that we went to the moon appears to be we have really good evidence that we went to the moon. We have good video. We have good pictures. We have eyewitnesses. And it's not offset so hard by the motives of the time that it's not believable. The best argument against going to the moon, that it was a hoax, that was a cover-up, appears to be just how incredibly difficult it was. And that might be enough. If you were to ask me personally, I would give it 80-20. I'd say 80% chance we went to the moon. 20% is a lot. 20% is a lot. Because remember, the government does lie about things. And sometimes they lie about big things. But there's so much that we don't know involved in this whole discussion that you would be on less firm ground to be too certain on it. But I would say, based on these heuristics, that we went to the moon. And if I were to bet money, if I were to put $1,000 down now about whether we went to the moon or not, on the assumption that 50 years from now, we would know with greater certainty whether we did or not in 1969, I bet money on the fact that we did go to the moon. You know, I wouldn't bet my whole life savings, but I'd bet a decent amount of money. You know, so hope that this walkthrough was useful, not just with the moon landing question, but with conspiracy theories in general, because remember, they're not all wrong. But it's easy to trick ourselves into thinking that they're all right just because a couple of them work out. So don't fall into that. Don't do the Curtis Yarvin thing and lean into the opposite of the mainstream just because you think that's more likely to be true. Every event has usually more than one opposite, and the opposite of a broken clock is usually also the wrong time. So, just do the Christopher Hitchens thing. Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way, whether it's a mainstream account or an alternative account. And ideally, maybe some combination of the two. It will, at the very least, make you a more interesting person. So, thanks so much for listening, and take care.